The man's eyes surveyed the room as he began to speak. The life of flight is a cruel thing. I have seen numerous battles and escaped the clutches of death too many times to count. Thousands of men once followed my call, but I am now without land, army, or title. All that I have left is my quest for vengeance. Precious time passes as I speak, so I will be blunt. Doom rapidly approaches your land, and you must be ready for it. The armies of the accursed Tamerlane draw ever nearer, watering the ground with blood. This warlord is the greatest scourge ever seen in all Asia. If you will listen, I will tell you of his conquests, of the terror that he has inspired. Born into the Barlas, nomads inhabiting the Central Asian steppe, Tamerlane was bred from birth to be a warrior. He spent his youth as a mercenary in the service of the local chieftains, but soon rose to power when his father, a chieftain himself, died. At this time, Transoxiana was divided between four powers. In the west lay the White Horde and the Blue Horde, mere shadows of the former glory of the Golden Horde. In the east were the two wings of the declining Chagatai Khanate. Tamerlane set his sights on these divided rivals. He was outnumbered, but he had a plan. Toktamish, a chieftain challenging his uncle Urus for rule of the White Horde, had sent messengers to Tamerlane seeking his support. If Tamerlane could defeat Urus and install Toktamish in his place, then Tamerlane could rely on the support of a powerful ally. As a child, Tamerlane had been dragged into Samarkand in chains by the Mongols. Now, all of Transoxiana was his to command. The leaders of the rival hordes all flocked to him to pledge their loyalty. The wind roared, whistling through the hall. Flames flicked in the great fires burning within, the distorted shapes resembling the forms of agile warriors. The unlucky few that did not submit were destroyed with fire and sword. Towers were built from their bones. Tamerlane was now a great Emir, or lord, but his thirst for conquest was far from over. Convinced that my guest knew a great deal about this Tamerlane, I asked him for more insight. I had heard that Tamerlane had been maimed by arrow wounds to his hand and leg. How could his armies accept a lame man as their leader? A fair question, he answered. It is said that Tamerlane and his fellow tribesmen agreed to decide who would lead them by a foot race. Although Tamerlane's men ran more swiftly, he cast his cap onto the stake marking their goal, and thus won the race. This man seemed cunning as a fox, a dangerous adversary for any commander. I asked my guest to continue his tale. Tamerlane gazed southwest to Persia, a land torn by strife ever since the fall of the Khanate. Persia was vast, its terrain a challenge to any ambitious conqueror. It would not be easy to take. Tamerlane, however, could count on the support of his ally Toktamish, who had reunified the Golden Horde. Together, they would ride down the squabbling Persian kingdoms. Toktamish's betrayal brought Tamerlane to a rare burst of fury. The man that he had regarded as a son, for whom he had sweated and bled, had stabbed him in the back. Tamerlane was forced to halt the Persian campaign to cope with this treachery. Thousands of battle-hardened cavalrymen ceased their pillaging and thundered northwest through the steppe to the lands of the Golden Horde and its allies in Russia. As if foreshadowing the tale to come, the snow of early spring began to fall outside. Winters lasted a long time in these parts, and even the nobles in the hall, clad in their furs, shivered. Tamerlane's vengeance was fearsome to behold, the men whispered. The blast of wind intensified, snuffing out some of the torches within the hall. Servants bustled about, tending to the meat roasting over the fire. The scent of cooked birds, game, and mutton filled the air. This was the first time that Tamerlane's forces had ventured into Europe. The winters were harsh, and Toktamish surely hoped that the biting cold and far-flung supply lines would prove too much for the wily tactician. The armies of the Golden Horde burned crops and took all they could carry as they retreated. Toktamish knew that Tamerlane would show no mercy. Terrifying reports reached his ears of torched villages and mountains formed from the bones of the slain. Wherever Tamerlane went, it seemed that flock of carrion birds were never far behind. Entire towns surrendered upon hearing of the brutal destruction of one of their neighbors. Toktamish had no choice but to engage the rampaging forces of his enemy. The armies met near the banks of the Kondarcha River sometime during the early weeks of the summer. Crows and vultures circled about the field, an ominous foreshadowing of the carnage to come. Raging fires, torrents of blood, piles of ash, the clash of iron, and the screams of the dying. These were the horrors that Tamerlane visited upon the cities and people of the Golden Horde. The cities of Ryazan, Sarai, Astrakhan, Azov, and Ukek were reduced to rubble. All that remained, aside from the ruins, were the towers of bones that were built from the corpses of the dead. Those who survived were driven like sheep to march in unspeakable cold. Toktamish had no choice but to flee west to Lithuania. Tamerlane was determined not to let the traitor escape, but word soon reached him of a rebellion within his homeland. Leaving the hunt in the hands of two of his generals, Tamerlane swiftly returned home to restore order, at the point of a blade. Listening to the stories of the stranger had stirred our appetites, and we eagerly began to devour our meal. I invited the old man to sit next to me. I still thought that this Tamerlane was more myth than man. Surely he had been beaten in a battle at least once. The man has the cunning of a wolf and the composure of an owl. In some battles, he strikes hard at the center of the enemy line, while in others, swift horsemen outflank the opposition. Then they feign a retreat to bait the enemy into a trap, a storm of arrows. When Tamerlane decided to cross the Khyber Pass into India, a different and terrifying challenge faced him. The armies of the Delhi Sultanate ruled the battlefields through their powerful elephants, monstrous beasts known to crush a horseman with a single foot. Drawing up his lines, the clever warlord waited to spring his latest trap. The Indian army relied on the charge of its dreaded elephants to shock their enemies and drive them into disorder. No stranger to the art of war, Tamerlane knew this. In a stroke of genius, he loaded the camels in his baggage train with straw and wood and set them aflame, whipping them toward the enemy lines. The sight terrified the elephants, who doubled back and trampled their own men. The battle was a rout. 200 years' worth of Indian treasure was loaded onto a train of wagons and carried back to Samarkand. In response to an uprising, Tamerlane's armies reduced the jewel of northern India to a charnel house. Death and fire mingled in a putrid stench that enveloped Delhi for weeks. Still, Tamerlane was not satisfied. There was unfinished business to the west. Silence gripped the court as the narrative evoked fear and awe. The meal had been finished for some time, and the fires were beginning to die low. If Tamerlane turned west, he surely would have collided with the mighty Ottoman Empire. Would he even dare to do such a thing? For some time, the local Turkoman tribes of the Levant had been requesting aid against Ottoman aggression. With his army rested and his coffers full of Indian riches, Tamerlane was ready for more bloodshed. He knew there was more than one way to motivate an army. Religious fervor and promises of land and plunder drove his men forward. This land was familiar with the terror of previous invasions, but nothing could prepare them for the onslaught that lay ahead. Thirsting for glory, Tamerlane's armies flooded across mountains, plains and rivers to terrorize Armenia, Georgia, and the Levant. Tamerlane's forces ran rampant, looting and burning as they went. For a land that had only recently experienced the plague, this scourge must have seemed to signal the end of the world. Although he was known for his military campaigns, Tamerlane was also a patron of the arts. When a city was sacked, the artisans and scholars were spared and sent to his capital at Samarkand, where they created a vibrant blend of cultures. Populations who resisted him, however, were not spared. After his siege had broken the Armenian fortress of Van, Tamerlane ordered its inhabitants hurled from the crags. Just like Hulegu, roughly a century before, Tamerlane showed particular cruelty to the city of Baghdad. Each man in Tamerlane's army was required to bring him 2 heads. The warriors slaughtered the population of the city, then slew the prisoners they had brought with them. It is said that to satisfy Tamerlane's command, some even slew their own wives. For the survivors of this savagery, it seemed as if the sun would never rise again. The relationship between Tamerlane and the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid was one of great enmity. The two of them had been exchanging scathing letters for years. Finally, Tamerlane had the opportunity to crush his rival, whose armies were weary from wars in Byzantium and Hungary. Even so, the Ottoman Empire was no trifling opponent, its army driven by intrepid leadership and the power of its Janissaries. The Ottoman force marching to meet Tamerlane was large, but divided. Turks, Serbs, Tatars, and various other vassals all contributed troops to this powerful yet volatile force. If some of them could be pried away and convinced to defect, the tide would turn in Tamerlane's favor. This would be his greatest test yet. The fate of 2 empires hung in the balance. The Battle of Ankara was a catastrophe for the Ottomans. Never before had they suffered the disgrace of having the Sultan captured in battle. Turning his armies around, Tamerlane left Anatolia in chaos. It is only a matter of time before he seeks another victim. The man ended his tale on that foreboding note. I realized that I had to prepare my kingdom lest my lands appear ripe for the picking. I ordered everyone to retire to their quarters. We would discuss this new danger in the morning. with clear and ready minds. Suddenly, the doors burst open, and a servant rushed towards me. Sire, a messenger from the Waldrod called Tamerlane is here to speak to you. He claims that you are harboring someone of interest to him. I turned to the old man who had not heard the messenger, and asked for his name. His weary, dark eyes met mine, and he answered in a grim voice. I am Toktamish Khan, of the blood of Genghis Khan, and the rightful ruler of the Golden Horde. Landless and friendless, all I have left is my death.